Thank you very much for bearing with us still for another 10-15 minutes to talk also about intellectual property. So just ahead, the thoughts and ideas expressed in this talk are not in any way related to IEEE, its affiliates, or anyone who has anything to do with IEEE. They're utterly and solely my own, and I'm speaking in my private capacity. And this talk is happening under Chatham House rules, so I would not appreciate to be quoted in public with what I have to say. So apart from this disclaimer, let's jump into the middle of the stuff that's happening. So I was very excited to listen to all of your thoughts about how to think in new terms about the technology in general and how to find new ways also to answer to some of the most pending challenges around autonomous driving. I'd like to invite you for the next couple of minutes to also think if we can think along new terms about the underlying rights that underpin this technology. We know about intellectual property, basically, that we can file it. I've heard from several people, should we really still patent? Patenting is a long process and it's tedious, and by the time we have the patent, I don't know if we would still need it as a company. And I've heard a little bit about litigation. But in between filing and litigation, there's this huge chunk, which I hope is going to be managing intellectual property like we can manage any other asset. And in this area, I think just as you have started to scratch on thinking in a new way about autonomous vehicles, we should also start thinking in new ways about how we can conceptualize and understand intellectual property. Because if we're starting to design new technologies and we are dumping on them an intellectual paradigm, an intellectual property paradigm, which is still very much rooted in the 19th century, you may just get a bit stuck in moving your technology really forward to where you want it to be. So the revolution that I'm suggesting is that we don't need to only think about autonomous driving as a technology, but we also need to think in new terms of how we can conceptualize intellectual property in this area. Because the technology in and by itself offers a new economic environment, and this new economic environment needs to be accompanied by new intellectual property strategies that hit the point to actually, on the one hand side, monetize adequately the intellectual property, and on the other hand side, assure adequate defense strategies. In this way, I think IP wealth generation and IP wealth maximization can go hand in hand with the wealth generation that we are hoping to generate through autonomous vehicles. If on the other hand side, we are moving forward with the craziest technologies on the planet, and we are still thinking in IP just as a very limited territorial right that gives me the entitlement to exclude third parties, I may just not be able to give my mind the space I need in order to really create the type of business opportunities I could otherwise create. So what I have heard, what was very exciting from what I gathered, what my personal takeaway was, the interconnectivity aspect. What I have understood from what you have been saying is that the autonomous vehicle space will be very strongly driven by interconnectivity and by multi-component products and services. And the value will be very much derived not so much from an individual product, but from the product in the network and from the product that is connected to many other products and services. How will that fly with how we are currently thinking about IP? If you have a multi-component product, at the moment you have on the telephone probably a couple of 100,000 patents which belong to many different companies. We all have a certain appetite to get some funds from this telephone in some way or another, hopefully. But if we're just doing this with the IP and the values in the network, in the relationship, in between the products, how can I hit the IP part to monetize that part in the best way? I think this is a hell of an important question for any company that wants to stay on top and make its shareholders happy. And with IP, maybe, I mean, I'm mainly thinking about patents, but the more I've been talking with Hugo and with others was that we need to think also more in terms of data as an emerging intellectual property right, quite frankly. I think when we're looking about data rights, we first need to find some just baselines from the legal side, who owns the data, etc., where we have a bit of a black hole at the moment from a governance perspective. If the value of the IP and the value of the business is more in the interconnectivity rather than in the final product, or in God's sake forbid in the hardware, the way we can conceptualize IP needs to follow that interconnectivity logic. And I think there the role for standard setting plays a fairly important role, because the standard setting process is a process where we are collaborating, where we are exchanging, where we are teaming up to share ideas, to share thoughts, to share new perspectives. And I think it is precisely this process that is needed to conceptualize the type of IP strategy that we need for autonomous vehicles in novel terms. If we have, again, every single company for itself thinking in terms of how we're going to come to grips with IP in autonomous vehicles, we may just never be that creative and original in giving our mind the business space it needs to come up with new solutions than if we are working in isolation. So I have looked up, if any, I mean, I was happy to realize I'm not the first one to think about possibly establishing a standard or an industry connections program for IP management. The ISO has started such a program. The German Institute of Standards has already, I think, is in the last steps of finalizing some standard around IP management. These are mainly patent management standards. We also have a standard for IP valuation from the German Institutes of Standards and from the Austrian Institutes of Standards, which unfortunately suffered the fate that nobody really ever used them. So which maybe also makes you realize, if you're really going to engage in a collaborative project around IP strategy for autonomous vehicles through the organizational structure of the standard, we need to make sure we are really hitting the right questions, because otherwise we produce paper that just goes on the shelf. So the type of mechanisms, I think, it's the wrong presentation. It doesn't matter. I had a few slides about open innovation and IP, but we have brought up the wrong presentation. It's not the end of the world. The reason why I think standard setting and open innovation is somewhat related is because open innovation also recognizes that you need to have a community, a crowd, a collaborative effort in order to come up to new ideas. And it recognizes that there are boundaries of the company in terms of its capacity to think about problems. And these problems can better be solved if you source in new thoughts and new ideas from third parties also. I don't understand why this mechanism cannot just simply also be used for the management of intellectual property, other than that the IP people get the cold skin when they think about sharing without having an NDA in place and without making sure nothing leaks which you don't want to leak. But if this slight cultural hiccup could be overcome, we could maybe find a baseline for such a discussion. I have so far only talked about wealth generation, IP monetization, data monetization, patent monetization through collaborative exchanges, and by understanding maybe how through the structure of the standard setting process we could achieve new perspectives of how to go along with that and how to open up the IP paradigm from just creating IP and suing people in some way or defending yourself to something which is a bit more rounded. And I really hope that this group, which is primarily not consisting of IP people, but more business and tech people, would be able to provide ideas, because in the IP community, we have gotten a bit stuck in our thinking, I must say. We live in our own silo of, oh my God, how does IPR Enforcement Directive Article 11.3 relate to Article 11, and what does proportionality mean under the most recent judgment in Qualcomm and Apple that the Munich court just issued in December? That's where we live in. That doesn't hit the point of the questions I'm trying to answer in terms of strategy and business management and the tech question. And we need new people with a different perspective to answer the question. Otherwise, we'll be just stuck talking about the same stuff over and over again. So I think it would be tremendously valuable if people with with diversity of backgrounds with a different view on it, maybe who are not total experts on what are the criteria of patentability, but who can also say this is our business perspective on the question, can come up with new ways of how to think IP. We have had some cross-fertilizations. We have had psychologists think about economics, and these people won the Nobel Prize for inventing behavioral economics. I would hope for similar cross-fertilizations with how to think about IP strategy through the means of a standard in the context of autonomous vehicles. So on the IP defense side, I mean, there's the one side, wealth generation through essentially finding ways of monetization in some way or another of intangible assets. And I think that's the most fastest way to generate wealth, by monetizing intangible and intellectual assets. But then there's also the other side of wealth preservation and of how to assure defensive strategies around intellectual property. If you look at the traditional defense strategy of a company in intellectual property, they would usually think, well, let's the business people and the tech people and the CTO define where we are going and we are following. And tell us what your product is, and we'll build a fortress around your patents, around your product, and we'll make sure that product is kind of clean, you're not stepping on someone else's foot, and you go ahead and build your product, we have the patents, and life is good. And that worked for a long time, and then it collapsed. This is similar to security paradigms we have seen evolve from states. We had for a long time the Cold War, and we did bet that our best safety strategy were nuclear weapons, which we could point at each other because we knew who the enemy was. Nowadays, the nature of risk is so diverse that we cannot point nuclear weapons to people who pull a knife on Knightsbridge and randomly kill people on the tube. The nature of threat has changed, and the nature of how to defend yourself against such a threat also needs to change. Cold War paradigms are not doing the trick anymore. If I draw the parallel to IP defenses, I see here a similar situation where companies have very carefully known in some sector who their friends are, who are less their friends, how to defend themselves. But if we're coming back to the thought that I tried to explain before, that the value is in the network and in the interconnectivity and in the enrichment of this ever-growing exchange between various players in the market where you don't even know who you're dealing with, that doesn't do the trick anymore. If you have an aggregated risk that can come from pretty much anywhere on the planet against your company, which can result in the fact that your whole company gets shut down because of a patent infringement, you cannot limit yourself to just building a few patents around your product. You're failing in your strategy. You're not doing what you can do to make sure your company is going to be safe. You need to find a way that responds to this network risk. And I think that the answer to respond to such a network risk is a network defense strategy. And such a network defense strategy can only come from, you mentioned open source strategies. I think we need to borrow more from the open source community of building networks of IP defenses. Maybe it could be something like intellectual property that lives in the cloud, aggregated by a whole bunch of companies you can then tap into when you have a problem from various tech sectors. Or it can be a system of exchanges where essentially there's mutual support in case there's some sort of patent, some sort of request for licensing revenue for patents where the underlying validity, for example, is close to impossible to be verified. So these type of things do require a networked solution to a networked security challenge. And there again, I think it would be tremendously valuable if we could start thinking of establishing some sort of group that starts to brainstorm about these things very quietly and very calmly. And maybe we could even come up with a study, or we could bring this further into some sort of expert group, industry connections group, or even establish some sort of norm or standard in terms of how to, what could be ways of interacting in in a novel way around intellectual property that really hits the point of where autonomous vehicles are going. Thank you.